Hey, Zach.
Hey, nice to see you.
Good to see you. I'm looking forward to your presentation. And I actually, before we even get into that, I wanted to just ask you, and maybe this is part of the presentation, but to tell a little story about how you got into this work. Is that part of your slides? Or because I don't actually, I mean, I know that you interned with Sepp Holzer, but that's kind of most of what I know about your background, other than that you're also from Vermont, which where I currently live. So,
Yeah, happy to touch on that briefly. It's not really in the presentation, but a little, but I think the big picture is that I'm someone who was lucky to grow up in Vermont with free access to the forest as a kid and always went out. And that was how I spent my spare time was, going out into the woods, building forts, playing in creeks and waterways. And we have this big, massive spring near where I grew up, and I would just go back there and spend time. And so I always wanted to do something positive with nature. Went to university, didn't find anything there, found these ecosystem greenhouses, earth-powered greenhouses that were very cool. Started a business building those for people, but they were very expensive. The material costs were crazy. And if no one did anything with it for a month, everything was dead because it was an entirely artificial system that, someone had to water, someone had to do something. We had to supply what nature is doing every day. And then I came across Sepp Holzer in 2012, and it was just everything I wanted as a child, as far as something truly ecologically beneficial, sustainable, using all natural materials, some technology and tools, but none of the plastic, none of the concrete, none of the all the stuff I didn't like about the greenhouses was just gone. And so that just grabbed me, and I gave him no choice but to keep teaching me, and just kept showing up. And I really learned everything I use on a daily basis from him over the course of 3 years working in the US and in Austria and a bit in Germany and other places.
and how did you actually find him?
He came to Montana, Flathead Lake, and a friend literally found a flyer on the street and said, "You should go to this." And I did, and totally changed my life at one
Wow.
event.
And so then you went over fairly soon after that to study with him?
Then we started an organization to keep bringing CEP to the United States and to
Yep.
bring English speakers to Austria.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't until the following year that we had the first one of those, bringing him to the US and people to Austria. And then we did that for 3 years. And then I kept working with him on projects and visiting and started a film project with him. And that eventually morphed into Water Stories.
Cool. Nice. All right. Yeah, I've been reading about his work to sort of catch up on your work. So since I know it's very sourced from there. And
Very much so.
and tell me what I'm looking at behind you as you're.
This is Sep's Place right here,
Oh,
the
okay.
Krameterhof. And so this is what some people call the Garden of Eden on Earth. And it is just a beautiful example of a farm where people can live in happiness and joy. The ecosystem is amazingly productive, and they produce all of their needs. Their food, fiber, fuel, medicine, everything that they need comes off of this landscape, basically. And their livelihood also comes off of it. And this is high in the Austrian Alps where you look around and it's all pine monoculture. Maybe a little bit of grain, maybe a little bit of dairy cows, but it is nothing like the oasis that Sepp created, and his son, Joseph, now continues to steward there.
Cool. So I invited you to talk about your work in California because, as you know, Walter Jena and I started a project back in 20, I guess it was 2018, where it was a tour that we set up on Can We Rehydrate California? And, as you know, my work has focused mostly on the soil sponge as a kind of a landscape scale water capture that is hidden from view under the soil surface. People use the term sponge to talk about forests sponging up water. They use it in a lot of different ways, but when I use it, I'm talking about soil structure and function, and how do we deepen that, and also which includes things like depaving and making it even possible for a sponge to be there. But and when I think you and I first met at the Soil Symposium in Montreal, and I saw your presentation there, and I was like, wow. And then at the end, you were like digging these big ponds, and I'm like, no, 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 don't break the sponge. And so I think I kind of set a little bit aside for a while because I was very focused on my intervention. And where I see as sort of like one of the key intervention points. But I'm actually writing an article right now about how we each have, all of us who are in this space, and you and I have both come a long way. People know our work. We kind of all have our favorite intervention point, or the things, or maybe it's not even our favorite, but it's the thing we're known for. So Brock Dolman's known for beavers, right? But that's not the only thing he thinks about, right? So like, I'm known for this little sponge, but that's not the only thing I'm thinking about. So I'm working on helping to map out all the intervention points. Like as I was just talking to Peter Bunyard, who was, I don't know if it was him saying this or him quoting Lovelock, but saying that it's like all of life's activities contribute to the climate that we love and that we're trying to maintain or restore or whatever. And there are so many different places where we can intervene, and so many different processes that we can help restore, so many different, as Ali bin Shahid's talking about, we need to think about what are the trigger points or the acupoints or the acupuncture points. I used to be an acupuncturist, or the, Carol Sanford would call the nodal intervention points that actually can make a bigger difference, whether it's in what they're doing or where they're doing it. So I'm kind of restarting in some ways, like, of like, let's look at all these different ways we can do this, and then let's build that into a conversation of where is a pond, and I know that's not all that you do, but where is a hilltop pond high in the land the best possible use of technology, the best possible use of human labor, etc. And where would it make more sense to focus on the sponge, or check dams or beavers or etc. Right? So anyway, so I want to kind of invite you into that context, that you have a particular niche that you have really gone with, and it's in the context of lots of other things that we can do. And California probably needs all of it. And I was thinking, you said something the other day about, you were talking to somebody and they said if we could just solve California. I don't know if you can say that again. That was a great, like, why
Yeah,
California?
absolutely, absolutely. And I think what you're speaking to is actually, in many ways, our foundational misstep that led to all of these issues is that we've all become so siloed. I think in a way, science really set us back in that the Western way of understanding, we said, okay, we're going to forget all knowledge and start back from scratch. So all of this indigenous knowledge that proved true over thousands of years was kind of cast aside. And then we started siloing things where we're learning more and more about less and less until we know absolutely everything about nothing at all. Because the reality is all of these pieces are interlinked. And when you touch one point, it affects all points. And if you're only looking at one narrow viewpoint, you're going to create unintended consequences that have as much potential to be negative as they are positive. And so, I didn't start out with this searching for water at all, or building water bodies, or any of this kind of stuff. What I saw is that all life is based on water. And when we do something for the hydration of the landscape, it impacts all life and it creates this ripple effect. And then it starts this inertia, and you take one step forward, and then nature takes the next 100. And you're really amazed at how quickly it can happen when the foundational element for life, water, is present in more of a state. And so for me, it's not, I totally see what you're saying as far as everyone gets focused on their one little thing, agroforestry, grazing, soil structure, whatever it is. But it's actually in using all these things together that we achieve anything meaningful. And I think too often people are scared by the big view, and so they focus in on the one little thing that they know. And to kind of bring an example of that, you can look at Pseudomonas syringae, the
Hmm.
cloud seeding bacteria that was discovered by David Sands. And David Sands, this is this professor from MSU
Hmm.
that discovered these
And Cindy
bacteria.
Morris, yeah, yeah, working with Cindy
And,
Morris.
and yeah,
Yeah,
Cindy Morris worked with him as well on this, and she's done really great work kind of moving it forward and evolving it even more so. And to give you a sense, they were trying to eradicate it at first because it was causing
right,
discoloration in tomatoes, and they
right.
didn't know, where is this coming from? Why is this? And so now David has this perspective that we could rehydrate the whole American West if we could just fix one little problem, California. And because California is breaking that moisture conveyance belt, both in a biological and a physics, atmospheric physics standpoint. And so actually the aridification of California is also aridifying the American West and creating the long-term persistent drought that's being experienced there now.
That's funny. I had forgotten that it was David Sands who was where what you were quoting there, and I thought you were going somewhere different with that story, which is that I often, whenever there's an article about bacteria and clouds, it's always going to Pseudomonas syringae because that's really the only one that's been deeply studied. And yet there are lots of different biological, not just bacteria, but other things that are seeding clouds, and every article quotes their research because that's that's the one that's gotten the most airtime. And so that bacteria is now seen as like the cloud seeding bacteria. And it's not at all. Like the sky, I often say, and I think in my book I talked about, the sky has a microbiome, just like we do. And plants have a microbiome, and soil has a microbiome, and every animal has a microbiome, and we have them inside us and on us. And it's not just bacteria, it's other things as well. So so I thought you were going to talk about that as an example of how we get focused on our part or our thing. But it's also, I'm happy to hear that David is looking at it in a much bigger context, because I think that is a lot of what's needed. So, and
And
I'll
what,
just say that the language that I like for what we're talking about here is that a big thing that we need to develop as a society is the ability to image or bring to mind a realistic image in our mind's eye based on actual experience of how all of life's activities work and work together. And that they're not just parts, dots on a map with lines between them. It's work, it's mutually influencing, it's as complex, way more than any human society, and how it all works together. And we need more and more to be able to see that, so that we can know, oh, if I could intervene here, has a really good chance of shifting everything. It's not even a leverage point. It's beyond that. There's this whole system that's going on, and I get to choose what my work is in there. And I also want to, just going back, I also want to say, hooray that we have these passions for certain things. Charles Eisenstein one time said to me, like, it's good, like we all get to work. Just because the climate is in crisis doesn't mean that your work, not mine, but somebody else's work on prisons isn't absolutely deeply important. Like the thing that calls you, if it's working to make the world go better, like do that. So, yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. And we really need help in all directions and people to pursue their individual talents, interests, experiences. And I think you touched on something really powerful there as far as this experiential based learning. There's some stuff that you cannot understand analytically. And you can only understand intuitively through observation and interaction and reactions of those interactions. And just to paint a picture of this guy in Montana that I learned about greenhouses from, he has this system called perpetual soils. He's been using the same soil in the greenhouse with no amendments, no outside composting, no inputs for 40 years. All the agronomists said your soil is going to run out of nutrients, everything's going to die, and it's actually getting better. And it's this self-enclosed ecosystem that actually works better than the multi-million dollar Biosphere 2.0 project in Phoenix, Arizona, and I taught him what the word ecosystem means.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
he created this beautiful, functioning, ecological ecosystem greenhouse without even the language to understand what he was creating. And to me, this is just one of those things where you don't have to understand it all to interact with it in a beneficial way.
Yeah,
And that's what he was really doing. He was following the work of nature, the work of God as he saw it, and letting that lead the process, and only accomplish this really amazing result because of having that more intuitive, faith-based interaction with the landscape.
yeah, yeah. Katie Ross and I don't know if you know Dr. Katie Ross, but we're gearing up for either a series of mini workshops or more likely one long course on different ways of observing and knowing. Everything from what you're describing of like direct knowing, and whether you say it's from God or from the landscape itself or the trees speaking to you, to physical observation. We take our shoes off and walk, and it's hotter over here and it's cooler over there, or taking a shovel and looking directly at, how deep can the roots go here, then up to more, things technological, all the way up to satellites. And how do we, since there are so many different ways of knowing, how do we use those or get comfortable with what's the right tool for the job, or synthesize that in a way that
Yeah.
makes it much more meaningful? And how do we make meaning out of those things? For so many years, indigenous science was not seen as scientific at all. And then it turns out, oh, wait a minute, they're able to predict things.
Way
And
advanced.
we don't know how to make a model to do what they're doing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things where I think people oftentimes just don't trust in their own experience enough. People are always asking me, is there some technology, is there some AI program that will tell you where to intervene and how to intervene and, just tells you. And I say, yes, there is an amazing, brilliantly designed technology to do that very thing, and it is the human body. We
Mhm.
are deeply programmed to receive information from the landscape, learn
Right.
from
We
it,
have
and
all
apply
these
it. It
amazing
was our
sensors.
survival forever. All these fine-tuned senses that can, and so it's kind of crazy to me that we're seeking that understanding from a place that's never going to give it to us when we have it inside of ourselves.
Mhm. Yeah. Cool. All right. Shall we dive in?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right.
So I like to have lots of visuals, so we're gonna just kind of cruise through a lot of this. Whoops. Let's get back to the beginning. And then Aditi, I guess just stop me wherever you want to discuss a bit more.
Okay.
Or yeah,
Yep.
jump in wherever as we go along. So the topic of this is and I would say not even we, I would say definitively, yes, we can rehydrate California.
Mhm.
And with water cycle restoration, we can actually reverse drought, flood, and fire by partnering with nature. And so some of the things that are possible, restoring ecosystems, recharging landscapes, reviving springs and rivers, turning deserts into paradise, and even mitigating climate extremes and restoring precipitation patterns. And so this is one project here in Portugal that my mentor Sep worked on. And this is the same project, same image, same location. This is just with the water from the sky.
Mm.
And when he first came there, they were asking him, because they didn't have enough water for their people living there, let alone gardens and orchards and all of these kinds of things. And they asked him, "Can we live on this landscape?" And he said, "If you could see this landscape through my eyes, you wouldn't even be asking that question. You would understand how silly of a question that actually is. Because here the road was draining all the water away. All of
Mhm.
the changes to the watershed that previous humans had made was dehydrating it. And so by undoing those changes, we can actually rehydrate and restore that landscape." And so this is Sepp Holzer, very dear mentor, friend, guide. It really just reprogrammed my brain, for lack of a better way to say it, of how to see the world. And when you look at the world through his eyes, this is what it looks like. And so all these stories we're going to talk about. There's film, there's all sorts of stuff on water stories. There's a whole film about Sepp and his story. Um, and this isn't just SEP. This is all sorts of people. This is in India. This is a community running out of water, drilled 27 wells, all of which were dry, and the young people were all migrating away. And then here is that same community after one earthen water body. And this one water body paid for itself 5 times over or 4 times over in the first year in the increase in agricultural productivity, and it's going to produce for this landscape for many generations.
Can you
Right?
go
And
back
these
again
people.
and so we can see the back and forth again?
Yep. And so this one's a little bit trickier because it's a little different angle.
Yep.
I'm trying to pull up it's not showing my mouse, but you can see the trees to the left of the screen and where the animals are, and that
Yep.
little gray patch, that's where the dam gets built. And then just by moving the earthen material around, they built the dam here, holding that seasonal flush of water throughout the landscape, giving them water for irrigation and rehydrating the landscape and making the creek downstream flow more often.
Okay, so
And
yeah, okay, I'm seeing the dam. You go back one more time. Yeah, so this is yep. And then the next one.
yep.
Yeah, so here's the dam here. Yeah. And so you're saying there is actually, in many cases with a dam, people say, well, then we don't get as much water downstream. But you're saying because it's actually raising the water table, the downstream flow is also better.
Well, and it depends very much on the type of dam. This is where things get really tricky in that there are dams that dehydrate the landscape, dams that rehydrate the landscape. I am anti-dam in many ways and very pro small earthen dams. And I think a Himalayan activist said it best when they said the solution to big dams is many little dams. And it's really
Hmm.
important that this is decentralized water retention, returning water to the earth rather than trying to hold it separate in reservoirs and tanks. When they design a big concrete dam, they'll oftentimes drain the catchment to get all the water going to the dam, which then ends up with the dam running low because they've destroyed the water retention of the watershed feeding that dam. And so instead, we're trying to create as many little dams rather than a few big ones, lots of small ones creates this rehydration and regreening effect.
Hmm.
And so this is another mentor of mine that will actually be visiting in January. If anyone wants to join, we have a great trip planned. And there they've revived 9 rivers now. One was dry for 4 decades and now flows perennially. And they've positively impacted 13 rivers and doing this same kind of thing, healing
This
landscapes
is,
with
for those
water.
who are just listening to the audio, this is Rajendra Singh, yeah, who's
And there's
in
the
Rajasthan, is that right?
in Rajasthan, exactly, in northwestern India. And we have a whole film about this project as well called Reviving Rivers. Um, and so, really amazing work using the tools and resources that we have available. In India, this is, the local people and a little bit of machine or equipment help. And in the US, this might be a excavator or machine heavy job for a little while to undo the work of previous machines, degrading the landscape to then create this kind of retention. And this is one of our projects in Oregon. This is the spring. I was just comparing, we have actually on this site a control spring in an area where we didn't do water retention, and the spring in the valley where we did. They were the same flow rate when we tapped them, and now this one flows 10 to 13 times more in the dry season.
Wow. And
So
so
we've
those
gone
retention
from
ponds are above or below this?
they are both above and below. So
Okay,
that
so where is the
spring
spring in
is
that picture? Yeah.
above the bottom water body in
Okay,
this
so in
picture.
here? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, below the top four water bodies.
Yeah,
And so
okay.
all of the recharge in the hillside of this spring has made that spring flow
Hmm.
more consistently throughout the year. And this is the really important part about these types of water bodies. Everyone gets focused on what the water that's in the water body, but the water that's in the land around the water body is as, if not more important. And so we're finding the natural earthen layers where we can tie into some type of geology that's desirable, use clay in the dam to then create a water holding capacity that's much bigger than the actual water body itself. And this is what creates the land recharge. And when you look at
Yeah,
Rajendra's work in India, sometimes they're even trying to deliberately get the water into the ground as quickly as possible to then use those aquifers later in the dry season once they've been recharged.
yeah. And I've been my understanding is that that an aquifer is really like deep ancient water, and that what we're recharging and things like this is more the groundwater or the water table. But people use the word aquifer in a lot of different ways. But what you're describing is the water that is, you know, up to 10 feet below the surface or something like that, not down in the, you know,
No,
down
it
rocks.
can be down. It very much depends on the type of aquifer. There's confined aquifers that are separated and are harder to recharge. There's unconfined aquifers
Mhm.
that you can recharge. And this might even, typically we're going to be able to for sure impact water in the first 10 feet, 3 meters. Then it becomes more site dependent on how far down we can impact water. In some places, like in California, actually, you have a huge amount of recharge where you can impact a well that's 300, 400 feet deep with your actions on the surface, even nearby that well. But that's a more unusual, that's a very unconfined aquifer where things go into it.
Can flow. Yeah.
And there is not, people get confused. There's not just one water level in the ground. There can be deep confined aquifers, shallow unconfined aquifers on top of those, and then springs and even shallower. And really, the springs are an expression of the hydration of the landscape that's feeding it.
Yeah.
So the recharge landscape for that spring is also, I would say, part of that aquifer because that's what's actually leading to the spring flow coming
And the
out where it
pressure.
is.
Yeah. 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 Of that water moving. Yeah. Yeah. I know I have lovely memories of hiking with my grandmother in the Adirondacks, and like there were spots where she would say, "You can drink here," and there'd be water trickling down out of this. And even here in town, one of the places I walk very frequently, my neighbor said that when she moved into her house, there was no water, and they would go fill up at the spring there. And yeah, in these like hilly, beautiful landscapes around here, that it's incredible. So sorry. So and I actually had one other question about that you were talking about the clay. So I was I've been thinking about ponds quite a bit because I knew I was going to talk to you. And some ponds really, if they have, some ponds really don't, percolate or infiltrate the water very much at all because you want it to stay there. So what's that? How do you think about like how much of a clay barrier, how slow, how much seepage is there? I'm sure that's
This
a
is,
longer and more complicated question, but
well, and it really comes down to the goals for the project. In one sense, if you're trying to restore downstream, the more permeable bottom that you create, the better. Now,
yeah.
to some extent, that can cause a risk of landslides, of other things like that. If you're hydrating quickly in steep areas, there's
Mhm.
more risk associated with that. Um, I think big picture, we're generally trying to stop water from going straight downhill
Hmm.
and let it diffuse into the sides of the hill, uphill, and potentially down in the bottom, depending on our goals for the project.
Hmm.
So, a dam we want to be watertight, even just for structural reasons. If water is moving through it on the downhill side, that's going to oftentimes lead to dam failure at some point, which
Yeah.
is really catastrophic.
And can you
The
talk
floor of
yeah.
the water body in Rajendra's case in India, they're trying to find vertically fractured rock for the floor to create a clay dam that stops the flow and lets it go in.
Hmm.
Now, that's not necessarily going to benefit that landscape directly, but it's going to benefit downstream in the
Yeah.
aquifer.
Yeah.
So then in some cases, you might want to find more of an impermeable layer to hold water on that's going to then service that landscape,
Right.
rehydrate for trees around it, give water for animals and insects and everything. So ideally both. I wouldn't say that there's one or the other, and you can even create structures that have some recharge areas where water goes in more quickly, and then some less permeable areas that holds water throughout the year.
And can you talk for a moment about fish, movement of fish and other aquatic life, since that's such a big topic with dams?
Yeah, and this is where, one of the big, just silly things that humans do is make really bad spillways. And so the spillways are what connects waterways. So you have a spillway coming into the pond and out of the pond. The way that we create a spillway is a very natural structure that fish can swim through without any issue, and that it weathers big flooding events very easily. Now, what people will do oftentimes is have pipes, culverts, different types of overflow structures that are very brittle. They're very easily broken by a big flooding event, and they cause impediment to fish passage. So if you're building a pond for an aquaculture setup, you might want to or need to do this specifically to isolate the fish that you're growing from the waterway. But if we're doing a kind of natural restoration project, we really want to allow the passage of animals in and out of the pond for a healthy ecosystem.
So would you always have it be that sort of at a height that fish can go upstream also, or
The
in terms of,
spillway is more of it looks like a natural creek. So basically, when that water is flowing enough that fish can travel through the system, they're able to. And then, depending on the climate, that might be year round, or in some places, the water might recede, the creek goes dry, and the fish can stay in the ponds. And then in the next floods, they can move around again.
okay, yeah, great,
Which
thank
is how, waterways also work. They have all these pools, and if they get dry, the fish are all refined to the pools,
you. Yeah,
the waterway starts flowing again, and they can travel once again.
awesome, thank you.
Absolutely.
I just know that kind of question is the kind of thing people get stuck on, like, well, wait a minute, what are we doing about dams? So,
Definitely. And that's why it's tricky is, there are dams that will interrupt the flow of waterways. There are dams that will change the flow regime entirely based on electrical needs of some city nearby. So you can't just, in my opinion, you can't be anti or pro dam. You need to talk about the type of dam it is, the type of impact it's having on the landscape, and all of these different things. Like in Rajendra's case or SEP's case, these water bodies are creating huge benefit to the surrounding areas, even reviving the flow of rivers in Rajendra's case. But then you look at some of the big dams and reservoirs done as either a reservoir for water, a hydropower dam, or both, and they're just truly catastrophic, the impact
mhm.
that they have on that waterway. So the devil, as always, is in the details rather
Yeah,
than
there's
a big
there's
picture.
there's a newish conversation going on around the dams in the Arctic, and that when they release the water, it's like a major climate thing that nobody's talking about, because there's suddenly all of this water released that, messing with ice and temperature and airflow and yeah,
Exactly. And in the more natural setting, the flow regime doesn't change, it's just buffered.
yeah,
It's like adding a big shock absorber or a big sponge, which are then the organs of that waterway, actually, so that it buffers those extremes on both ends, but it's not actually changing the time of year and when it's flowing. It might just be extending flow
Yeah.
as things get dry, for example.
Yeah. Okay, carry on here.
And so these stories are really all over the world. These are just some of my favorites. This is why we created Water Stories, because no one knows any of these people or any of these stories. Um, and then we're creating this new generation of people. These are our students now doing this kind of work all around the world. And so, what is water cycle restoration? It's science with sense. It's combining the best of indigenous ways of knowing and traditional ecological knowledge with the modern tools that we have available to us today. And I think I'm going to speed through some of this, but this I just love. It's from Chief Joseph. We do not want churches because they will teach us to quarrel about God as the Catholics and Protestants do. We do not want to learn that. We may quarrel with men sometimes about things on this earth, but we never quarrel about God. We do not want to learn that.
Mm.
And I think this speaks to just kind of a fundamental separation from the landscape that has happened in humans. You look at the Oxford Dictionary definition, in the dictionary, nature is opposed to humans or human creation,
Yeah.
and there really is no separation there. And when we look at this manifested on the landscape, like New York City, Manhattan, we see what it was like under indigenous stewardship and under colonial stewardship. And in my opinion, it's really a tragedy that through colonization, people are starving, depriving, and ruining their own landscapes, mostly for the betterment of someone else. You
Hmm.
imagine that original forester who came down and cut this, the guy cutting the tree didn't make very much money at all. It was the lumber barons and all those people that really made the money. And the same thing is happening through today. This tree, Big Mama, when it was young, people could drink from any water on the continent of Turtle Island, North America. Now, in Minnesota, the land of lakes, they found that no lake in the state met the state's quality standards for fishable or swimmable. So we've
Oh,
gone from drinkable everywhere to the land of a thousand lakes doesn't have one that you're supposed to fish out of or swim in.
wow.
And so one of these traditional ways of knowing taught us that the forests call the rain. Western science thought, oh, people get confused, but now we're learning actually, oh, yes, the forests do call the rain. We're just learning about the biotic pump and bioprecipitation now. I wouldn't be surprised if there's even more ways that the forests are calling the rain. So the biotic pump, you have this phase change of water, creating this kind of vacuum effect where it goes from very large as a vapor to very small as a liquid. And that's, for example, what creates this green lush area in the southern portion of South America. That area should be dry. If you look at that latitude around the world, it's deserts because of the way the Hadley cells cycle water. But in this case, you have so much water being pulled in through the forests of the Amazon, creating that biotic pump that then moves along the Andes to the southern portion of the continent. And so, if you remove that pump, you then get the aridification of not just the area where the Amazon is, but the areas in the southern portion of the continent as well. This is basically what's happened with California and the American West.
And is
Um,
happening in the Amazon slowly, but more and more rapidly. So, yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Which we are,
And so
that's
this is
part
a
of a, I'll just say that we are, last week we had a workshop with Rob DeLate and this week with Peter Bunyard about the Amazon and the biotic pump.
and so this is kind of the seminal paper, very worthwhile to check out. And then what we're learning is that water, we think of water as freezing at 0 degrees Celsius. Water actually does not. It freezes anywhere from -40 to slightly above zero, depending on the conditions. And one of the main things that it needs is a precipitation nuclei, something to gather upon, allows that water to freeze and change phases at higher temperatures. So these are really good papers by David Sands and Cindy Morris that we mentioned before. These are really seminal, highly recommend the reading. The big takeaway, or one of them for me, is that the organic molecules that incite freezing work at much warmer temperatures then the inorganics like salts, like soot, like dust, volcanic ash, all of these kinds of things. This is why cloud seeding works, for example. But the biological work at much warmer temperatures and beget more water. They actually grow on the landscape, move into the atmosphere, and create more water, whereas the inorganic kind of stop the conveyor belt right there. It doesn't restart and continue going. So when we look at the Amazon again, for example, 50 to 80% of the moisture, the rain received in the Amazon is driven by these microorganisms. So if we cleared all the forests all at once, we'd lose 50 to 80% of the precipitation there. It would not only become a savanna, it would become a desert, and the southern portion of the continent would desertify as well. And so this is looking at the full healthy water cycling. I think for the sake of time, we'll just kind of we've talked about a lot of these factors, but really you need that moisture conveyor belt, that phase change of water, those microorganisms to incite the freezing, to create the phase change, to form droplets, clouds, and then rain. And then what kind of soil that rain meets is really important in terms of whether it's accepted or rejected. In a
Hmm.
cool, shaded, structured soil, it infiltrates rapidly, it's absorbed, it recharges the ground, and it feeds springs and streams downstream.
And I'll just say one thing, and this is where what I was making reference to earlier about um, David and Cindy's work, that we think of that bioprecipitation or cloud formation as happening through just freezing, but that's Pseudomonas syringae. But there are some that will create a suspended water droplet or collect enough droplets to actually become something heavy enough to fall out of the sky as rain directly without going through the freezing cycle. So there's several different ways, and it's different over different kinds of forests or different kinds of landscapes. So yes, carry on.
Absolutely. And this is where, going back to that intuitive versus analytical, if you're trying to analyze every little potential piece and avenue, you're going to drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to just think, okay, healthy ecosystems create more rain. That's kind of the indigenous way of looking at it. Um,
But I
so,
do think understanding
absolutely.
that life is involved, over whether it's over the oceans, whether it's in the Arctic, whether it's tropical forests, that life is involved. It's this soil, plant, microbial, thing that's all going on, and that the sky is alive is really key. And it does make me wonder, when we know how much like glyphosate is in the air and other pesticides, et cetera, are actually airborne. And I know glyphosate's always the bad guy, but there's plenty of others in the pipeline. But
Exactly. Yep.
glyphosate was patented as a broad spectrum antimicrobial by Monsanto. And so if our sky is not only full of a microbiome, but full of antibiotics, how is that playing into the loss of rainfall and water cycling? So
Absolutely, absolutely. And like you said earlier, we get so attached to the one little thing. We discover Pseudomonas syringae and we think, oh, wow, this is the miracle bacteria. It's fungal spores, it's all sorts of bioaerosols. We narrow in on the things that we know, but that's also a pattern that repeats itself in many different ways in different biological organisms within a healthy ecosystem. And so if people want to check it out, we have whole animations about this. I'm going to just kind of skip over those for the time being. All of this is available on waterstories.com as well. But we see that humans are creating this big issue, and here we really get to the California problem. So if our prevailing winds are coming from the west to the east, as we break that conveyor belt as it's getting started, basically, from San Francisco down through Tijuana, we've hardened, we've destroyed 95% of the wetlands in California. The whole Central Valley used to be a big expanse of wetland and is now an agrochemical wasteland. So we're breaking the conveyor belt at the start, and that's also what's leading to Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, all of that aridifying as well because of this. And when we look big picture, about half of the precipitation we're receiving is evaporated or transpired locally on the landscape. So as we aridify, we also lose that portion of the precipitation downwind. And this is why California poses such a risk to the American West as a whole. And it's probably the single best example of horrible management. You know, you look at the Owens Valley, for example, there's a great documentary on this Power and Water, a California heist, where they basically, it's so absurd, it's insane. They basically, the public developed this multi-million-dollar utility. They gave it to a private family, the Risnicks, the wealthiest farmers in California. And now, because the Sacramento River is running out of water, they pay them if they don't use it. So, multi-million dollar infrastructure given to this wealthy family behind closed doors. And now, if they don't use it, the government will pay them to leave the water in the river. So, it's just an insane situation. And the water rights system in general in the United States is incredibly broken. It's first in time, first in right. So, whoever came to kill the indigenous people first, they own the water outright, and everyone, it's a later right, gets it only if it's available. And then we have this prioritization of downstream flow, where if we're always prioritizing water getting downstream to downstream users, we are functionally dehydrating our landscapes, creating less water within those landscapes.
Mm.
So the
The other,
way we've
go
created
ahead.
water rights is actually leading to the aridification of these areas as well.
I was just going to say one of the shockers. I served on a state appointed working group on payment for ecosystem services and soil health, and it was a multi-year project. But in that working group, as we were in it, we started to understand, and these things were actually happening in the background, that there were financial instruments being developed, and we were kind of almost like a guinea pig group that was they were watching like what we were doing. And one of the things that happened right around the COVID shutdown was that water became a tradable commodity. And water being a tradable commodity means that people can bet on, like water futures, sorry. Like you can bet on whether water is going to be more or less abundant. So people can make money out of water short, betting on that water will be short, kind of like they did, prior to the 2008 financial crisis of betting on real estate being short. And let me actually just, this is like worth saying because I just find this so shocking, and you're kind of getting into this. If you look up on Investopedia, which is like a website for investors, and you look up water investments, this is the opening line in there. It says, "We know water is the source of life, but it can also be a source for portfolio diversification. Like gold and oil, water is a commodity, and it happens to be rather scarce nowadays. Investors can gain exposure to the commodity through brokers who offer water indexes, mutual funds, and exchange-traded funds. So, as with any other scarcity, the water shortage creates investment opportunities." To me, that is
And
kind of like, it's like everything tells you everything we need to know about where we are in history right now, the
uh,
sort of cheerful language of that is just mind-boggling.
Absolutely. And the mere privatization of water creates scarcity because of the market dynamics involved. If you imagine in a water abundant world, water is valueless. Everyone has access to it whenever they want it. No one has to pay for it. In a water scarce world, water is the single most valuable commodity.
Mhm, mhm.
And so these privatizers are actually incentivized to increase scarcity because then they make more profits. And especially when you get to the point where people in accounting high rises with spreadsheets are making management decisions based on economic factors, the more scarce water becomes, the more money they will make. And so that's the decisions that they're going to make. And then the whole use it or lose it is just crazy because say you have you have a lesser right than me, and I have a right for a certain amount. If I don't use my full right because I want to let you have some water, I can lose my right. And so
Mhm.
I'm actually incentivized to waste water even when I don't need it to have future access to
Yeah.
that water. It's just a totally insane, broken system that we need to be really careful with because the countries that have and are privatizing water, like Chile, like Australia, like I think even the UK, maybe now, I'm not sure about that one, but they're getting into a really, really broken, harsh situation that's just going to get harder and harder to fix. And
Mhm.
so I think this is one of the biggest crises of our time.
And I learned from there was a woman who was the kind of U.S. climate envoy for certain parts of the military, Deborah Loomis, who I think it was from her that I heard that the U.S. was building a huge military base in South America at that crosses over multiple countries. That's over the biggest aquifer for South America. So yeah, so we're and I mean
Not
even
by coincidence.
no, in even back in 20, in the 2010s when I was writing The Ecology of Care, people were already if you look up US sort of military websites, they were already saying back then that the next wars are going to be fought not over oil but over water. So it's yeah. I mean, and
And
it's
it's
not
happening
anything
already.
new. I mean, that's I think wars have been over water for a long time, but
Yeah,
yeah. Anyway, carry
absolutely.
on.
And I think this over
That's the
extraction
good
of
news.
groundwater is the neglected mega crisis of our time. In
Yeah.
that you look at the most progressive legislation is the California Sustainable Groundwater Act to try and reduce groundwater over extraction. And by their own targets, if they hit their targets for sustainable water use, only 50% of all of the wells in the state will be dry.
Wow.
The private, the municipal, the agricultural. And so they're setting the bar so low that there's no chance. And this is the watershed death spiral that we often cite, where essentially, as you create hot, hardened landscapes that reject the water, when the rains come, it all goes downstream, creating a flood, then also creating drought. Then you get rising high pressure heat domes that prevent the incoming maritime humidity. Pressure builds, and you get bigger, stronger storms than ever before with longer periods of drought in between and these cycles of flood, drought, and fire. Really important as the soil itself heats up, becomes more exposed, its ability to hold water decreases. And so it actually starts rejecting the rain, even if it hasn't been paved over, just because of temperature. And then as something like the Earth increases in temperature, its ability to hold temperature increases exponentially. So this is why a wood stove works so well. As it heats up, it can hold more heat. Same kind of thing is happening right now with our Earth. So we have a whole animation about this as well, and it really leads to these cycles of flood, drought, and fire. I'm going to kind of speed through the the bad parts
Yeah,
of this because I think a lot of your
my
audience.
folks are pretty familiar with the flood drought and fire piece. Yes.
And you can look at basically any city. It's all hardened surfaces designed to drain the water away. And not only that, but they're in the bottom of valleys. So all the mountains are directing their water to that valley that used to be expansive wetlands, and that water is being drained as well. So you get
Yes,
these
I think
big,
Los Angeles, that water is leaves the city and is in the ocean within 20 minutes. And of course,
crazy.
the LA River is made of concrete. So
Exactly. And, if you look at water flow over time in these two different situations, it happens all at once, creating the flood and all of those issues. And then there's no water flow through the system, meaning there's no evaporative or transpirative cooling happening. So the landscape gets hot, hard, dry, and the next rain creates a flood again.
that looks
And
like
then in the other
A Walter
situation,
Yena drawing.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah, we developed this together. We have again a whole animation that kind of shows this. Um, and if we just look real quick, the results of the watershed death spiral, we can go all around the world and see the desertification. The Fertile Crescent, The plow and the animal was invented here about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and around that same time, the whole region is desertified. The plow and the domestic animal came to the Sahara between 6 to 8,000 years ago, and that desertified. Came to the Tibetan Plateau 6,000 years ago, and that desertified. And this one was contiguously inhabited for 20,000 years.
Mm.
So it wasn't human habitation itself, it was the changing of the water cycle in, on the landscape. And then we can see the American West. This is currently ongoing. And if we look big picture, over the last 10,000 years, we've desertified 1/3 of Earth's land, and we've degraded 2/3 of Earth's land. We've lost 87% of the Earth's wetlands. And we say lost, they were really destroyed. They were turned into farmland, turned into developments, all of these things. And this is where I think it's so important to understand our agency and need to do something about this situation. Because in many places, you clear cut a forest, you leave it for long enough, it will become a forest again. When you drain and drain tile a wetland, it's not going to become a wetland again until you undo that drainage.
Yeah,
And this
and I
is one
think
of
a
the
lot of people
first,
don't know about tile drainage, um, that it's actually putting in drain pipes under the land so that water cannot collect there. And that's happened in a
exactly.
lot of places. So,
And it creates so many issues in the waterways and so many issues on the landscape itself. It's really pervasive. And this is where right away we were working that first project with SEP on tribal land. And so we had to get the tribal council's approval. And someone asked them, what do you guys think of this big equipment coming in here and digging everything up? And they said, well, we've seen a lot of damage by these machines, but we hear what this guy's saying and he's working with nature. And so we're going to give it a chance. And SEP said something powerful. He said, when the damage has been done with a 20-ton excavator, it's really hard to undo it with a shovel.
mm,
And so oftentimes, if a land is really degraded or damaged, we need to do some big movements to restore the kind of condition it used to be in. And the water outlook is bad. I don't need to go into great detail here, but I think the easiest way to think about it is think about the water in the earth as a bank account. And it's invisible, it's unseen, it's underground. I think that's why it's so underappreciated. We all know what happens if we take more of our out of our bank account all the time than we're putting in. We get into debt, we get into this really bad situation. If instead we're always putting in a little bit more than we're taking out, we always have some extra for when we need it. So, big picture, we really need to increase recharge and decrease discharge. And this is nothing new. Plato was talking about this 2,400 years ago, about how the land was the richest in the world. It was cultivated by lovers of honor and nature. And now the land was degraded, the springs have all disappeared, the forests aren't there anymore. And he's talking about in this previous state, he even connects it to the climate. He says, such was the state of the natural country, which was cultivated by lovers of honor and of a noble nature, had a soil the best in the world, an abundance of water, and in the heaven above, an excellently attempered climate. So this was 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece, Plato talking about the relationship between land degradation and climate change. And a non-excellently tempered climate, a disturbed climate, a rough climate.
yeah, I love that quote. That's just so incredible. Yeah.
And you imagine what's happened since then. I mean,
Right.
we've gotten a lot better at destroying places. They didn't even have diesel equipment back then. And I really hate that we call these natural disasters because there's nothing natural about them. They're the direct result of human management. And I think in the modern climate change movement, people have kind of hitched their cart to the wrong horse. Whereas if we do everything we can with carbon that we know, we won't even know if it's working for 20 to 50 years because of the buffering capacity of the ocean.
Mhm.
When you work with water, you see the results the first time it rains. And so, on a human life cycle, people can be benefited by their work, see the impact, and get excited to do more. And this is where, if we look at the heat dynamics of the Earth, they're mostly driven by water, very little driven by carbon. This is because water has a higher specific heat, meaning it holds more temperature. It's way more present in the atmosphere, And it has these huge amounts of energy that it absorbs and releases in its phase change. And so you can really start to see how much of our climate is driven by water. These are the reasons that, our mutual friend Walter Yana will say 95% of the heat dynamics on Earth are driven by water and 4% or less driven by carbon. Now, that's on one end, I would say the two-thirds to one-third number is more conservative. And so more than two-thirds driven by water, less than one-third driven by carbon. Where you fall within that range depends on how you do the math.
And I
But we
think
can
it,
also
yeah, I
we
was
can
just
also
going to
see how
say,
water is very difficult to model because it is present at different amounts in different parts of the atmosphere. 2,000 parts per million in the Arctic versus 50,000 parts per million in the equator versus 420. And then it's got these phase changes. So it just was, to a large degree set aside because of its complexity with early climate modeling.
it's a shapeshifter. I'll just say that, I think it's important to think about climate as Mian talks about the two legs of climate, and that we used to study both of these aspects. We used to study the atmospheric dynamics of greenhouse gases, which includes water, is the largest greenhouse gas. But and yes, carbon dioxide and methane, etc. And then we used to study the changes in surface temperatures based on what's going on with life on land and how much has been paved over and is absorbing more heat, etc. And so it's not that reducing fossil fuel burning isn't important. It's just that there's this whole other neglected thing where we have so much more agency to actually make changes right now. And also, as you said, that those changes are going to be things that we can experience the benefits of in our lifetime, which is really, we need to create, as Walter says, many, many, many oases so that we can get through this time period while we figure out what the hell to do with fossil fuels, etc. So, not to mention that fossil fuel burning interferes with water cycling directly by creating these humid hazes and makes it hard for clouds to form and rain to fall, etc. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. And when we look, our most recent warming is mostly ascribed to loss of cloud cover. You can see most of the time we're looking at the Earth, it's this map when really 50% of it is covered with clouds at any given time. And our recent warming is mostly due to loss of cloud cover, which, if you've been paying attention, you can really start to see how our degradation of landscapes leads to loss of cloud cover and humid hazes rather than reflective clouds. Um, and so there's this really big piece. And maybe about a year ago, was talking to Anastasia Makaravia, and she noted how the latest generation climate model they haven't released because it's very broken. And it's supposed to be the first one to actually account for clouds properly within the model. They use it to predict forward and to predict backward. And this one is just, it can't predict backward what has been observed. So
mm.
even our next generation climate model still doesn't accurately account for clouds and how important they are. And I think for the sake of time, we won't go through all of this, but if you look at Walter's math, how he gets to the 95% versus the 4%, or how other people get to two-thirds versus one-third, you can look at the incoming radiation, how it's handled, and how many of these processes are driven by water. And a lot of them, most of them on this list are driven at least in part by water. And so how we're managing, and we're actually seeing also a heating of the lower atmosphere along with the cooling of the upper atmosphere, leading to this disconnect between the two. And that is mostly managed by water and its phase change and moving, absorbing heat at the surface in its phase change, dissipating that heat in the upper atmosphere in its phase change. And to give you an idea of how much that is, because it's hard to put these numbers in perspective, but when a tree transpires a liter of water, that liter of water absorbs a car battery's worth of heat energy. So that 1 liter of water becomes a cubic meter of water vapor, absorbing 680 kilowatt hours of heat energy in the process. So we're breaking this conveyor belt that moves heat around as well. If we look at the yearly loss of water from damaged ecosystems, and then we look at that amount of water transpired in those ecosystems, that is equal to 250,000 terawatt hours each year of water that we're losing that should be transpiring and cooling on land. How much is that number? That's almost 10 times the total energy production of humanity each year.
Wow.
So humanity produces 28,000 terawatt hours each year. The waters that we're losing, its ability to absorb and dissipate heat is 250,000 terawatt hours, so almost 10 times that. So we start to see that we have this huge agency, like you're saying, and we can really have a clear way forward where we can work with nature in these positive feedback loops. And the really beautiful thing is, regardless of what happens, having a blue and green oasis is going to be helpful in the future. If it's a hotter planet, if it's a colder planet, if it's exactly the same temperature, we need blue and we need green as humans to thrive. And when we increase the water capacity of a landscape, we increase the productivity and health of that landscape as well. So a lot of times we're really just trying to balance the budget. You know, you see a home, roads, lots of hard surfaces creating runoff. And so to not even talk about being beneficial, if we just want to be neutral, we need to find ways to hold that water on the land and let it return, a la the water body here at the bottom that's collecting the water that's running off of this landscape and creating beautiful habitat, an oasis, a nice place to swim. The blue heron comes here and eats fish all the time now. And this was not even a wet spot before. And fortunately, we can have this big impact quickly. This is the first project we did with SEP. This was a wetlands where previous owners had built an airstrip through the wetland. Somehow that was allowed, but then we undid it in 11 days of machine time and then a couple of months. Here's the change on that landscape by restoring the water flow, the water holding capacity, the water household, as SEP calls it, of the landscape. And so we know water can flow or it can crash, and we want it to be in that slow flow. And a really easy way to understand this is where water's running, help it walk, where it's walking, help it crawl, and where it's crawling, help it go into the ground. And if you can move water along that trajectory, you're going to end up rehydrating landscapes. So we're working towards the revived water cycle where us humans can be the keystone species in the restoration of Earth's ecosystems. And oftentimes we're doing some form of decentralized water retention, which can include everything from earthen water bodies, terracing, infiltration basins, leaky weirs, beaver dam analogs, contour trenches, or even just biological enhancement. You know, improving the quality and health of the soil is a great water holding capacity. And we're not just treating the waterways, but the catchment areas as well, which is really important. And so in this picture, you can see that first project a little bit better. You see this dam on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Oftentimes for logging and industry, roads are put in right up the low lines, which then creates a conveyor belt for water out of that landscape. And so in this landscape, they undid the conveyor belt, creating an earthen dam to hold that water back. And so in some cases, we're using excavators and big equipment and the tools available today to create a system that, if you do it right, is going to last for thousands of years until the next ice age, essentially, if you do it really well. And so that's one thing that I really love about these systems versus the greenhouses. We did all this work, and if no one did anything for a month, everything was dead.
Hmm.
On these landscape projects, if no one touches it for 10,000 years, it's still going to be producing life. It's going to be producing drinking water for animals and insects. It's going to be producing water for trees. It's going to be balancing the climate. It's a one-time, heavy-handed, big cost, both economic and environmental in the equipment to create a long-term ripple effect that really lasts for many generations. Um,
Awesome.
And I'm
And
gonna just,
yeah, take us back to what are the takeaways for California? Although, yes, if you have other things you want to show. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know. We're getting so just to show kind of the level of bounty that can come off of a landscape like this. This is a fruit tree falling over with its own productivity,
Mm.
grapes growing up it, fully loaded, and this is with no inputs. This is just partnering with natural forces. And so just holding the water on the land, building the capacity of the soil, working with the ecosystem to grow the forests, you can create these landscapes where food's just falling on the ground year round. Um, and this project I really like because this was a parking lot 3 years ago. And the Army Corps of Engineers had actually approved a developer to fill in a wetland. And so we came in to recreate this wetland. And now this wetland that used to be a parking lot is habitat for axolotl, which are very rare in Montana. They only grow in pristine water when there's enough food in the water for them to stay in their aquatic life form, and then they'll become an adult as an aquatic axolotl. And they're only found in 2 lakes in the whole state, and now a third one, which used to be a parking lot 3 years
Wow.
ago.
That's awesome.
And so the takeaways for California, really we can stop this whole cycle. I want to look at, one example for fire. This is just a great example of what's possible. Peter Marshall in Australia, a landscape that's very similar. I always joke that California and Australia are in a race to the bottom of the watershed death spiral. And this was a landscape that was a gold mine that had one tree on it, where he created water retention, restored the landscape, vegetated, planted willows, and had it burning around him for 2 months, coming in from every different angle, and his place didn't burn. All
Wow.
of the neighbors' ashes, but because of the hydration of the landscape, the work with the fungal community, the work with the willow, his property was spared. One of our projects in Malibu, California, was saved twice, first from the fires and then again from the flood and the landslide that ensued. Now, I don't show a lot of pictures of this place because everything we did was pre-legal in the state of California, you could call it. And actually, to try and permit the work that we did would have cost more than the project itself.
Yeah.
So in this case, the client decided to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And their house had already been saved twice. When the fires came, all the neighbors burned. The hydration, the decentralized water retention, the terraces, and the forestry on this landscape made the fire stop basically at the property boundaries. And then after the fire in this chaparral landscape, you get these big floods and landslides, and the water body caught all of that landslide.
Mm.
And so it had to be dug out to be a water body again, but it's much easier than trying to remediate a house that's been buried in a landslide like that. And so just some big tenets, balance your water budget, plant the rain, and then plant the plants. And a really good example of this, our friend Walter Yena and this project in the Canberra Botanical Gardens in Australia. Here they created an artificial rainforest by holding water, circulating water, planting pioneer species. And so it just is a great example of what's possible with this kind of work. And there are so many results all around the world. We don't need to go into all of this, but here's just speaking to your point. This is the LA River. This is what it probably should look like. Here's what
Hmm.
it looks like today. And so it's really important that we become the voices for the landscape to help people understand what could be possible. In Rajasthan, not only did it create a water abundant landscape, they're producing 3 to 4 crops a year instead of one. All of these positive impacts, they revived 250,000 wells, but also now girls are going to school because they don't have to carry water all day.
Hmm.
And so these simple changes of how people hold the water on the landscape create these ripple effects. And so my big goal is just to help as many people as possible start earning their livelihood through healing the earth, helping people understand what's possible. This is why we created Water Stories. It's spread all around the world. We offer an online course that people can join anytime. We offer in-person workshops. And I like to leave with this quote that knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And
Mm.
this is what we really try and help people with, is how they can use their own hands to give back to the earth. We all think about how can we have a smaller footprint. I want to have as large of a footprint as possible, or as large of a handprint as possible, because I know our footprint can be positive. And if we're only ever focused on having a less negative footprint, we're always going to have a negative footprint.
Yeah.
So, how do we really find the ways to have a positive footprint? And this is really what Water Stories is all about.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's great. That was awesome. There's so much crossover with our work and the story that we're trying to tell. And I know it's in part because we've been inspired by some of the same people and by some different people. So yeah, I thought it might be just good to take 5 minutes to think about like if we had an unlimited budget, which California almost does a lot of the time, in terms of the concentration of resource there. What would you, what would you, how would you approach California? A, in terms of projects, but also in terms of policy? Are there anything, because we've got actually a pretty big California audience that listens to this and that's been engaged and that we've been meeting for workshops. And I think people are starting to understand how it all works, but they don't necessarily know where to start or what to do. And I know, I mean, Brock and Kate worked for 20 years on power mapping related to the whole beaver restoration work and succeeded. So it's not like we're going to figure it out in 5 minutes, but it also is good to put sort of fresh minds that are looking at it from outside and say, well, if we could, what would we do?
Absolutely. And I think it's actually a lot easier than people might imagine. I think the biggest single piece is we need people to start creating demonstration projects. And these are these green oases that you spoke of. I can think of, for example, one of our projects in Oregon, Tabula Rasa Farms in the ground. That one project has inspired so many other projects in that region. It's insane. We
Mm.
go work there every year now. We're doing projects for the neighbors' neighbors, because once people can go and experience it, it all clicks into place. And it's
And what
not
is the
this
project?
mythical fairy tale. Here, that was the one I showed with the spring that flows at 10 times now
Okay.
with all the water bodies. And we did lots of work over 5 years on different parts of their property. That's maybe the most extravagant and grandiose, but lots of little features embedded throughout the property have been equally as beneficial. Small water bodies and things of this nature. And so having places where people can go and see it, I'd say that's foundational number one, most important. You're never going to get a legislative party to buy into it without being able to experience it for themselves. So we need, as Sep calls it, some people with civil courage, some people to just go ahead and create the projects and provide the demonstration for other people, like Brad Lancaster in Tucson, Arizona, doing
Mhm.
the curb cuts on the weekend when none of the city workers are working. Now it's required on new developments.
Mm.
But that would have never happened without him cutting the curbs on the weekend. So some leaders, some early adopters providing demonstration projects, I think that's number one most important single piece. Nothing moves forward without that. Beyond that, I think that the team, the New Water Paradigm team in Slovakia, now working as Water Holistic, actually has a really clear, simple, brilliant action plan for this. And this is what they did. I think one of the really important parts is that government loves grandiose projects because one, they can show them off, and two, there's lots of ways for various people throughout the thing to skim money off of it. And if you have a $5 million budget, it's a lot easier to send away $5,000 here,
Yep.
$500,000 here, all of that kind of stuff. And so when they did the big flood mitigation project in Slovakia, that's what the government was really pushing for. They said, let's do a few big demonstration projects. And they said, no, 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 no. This has to be decentralized, implemented by the communities that know
Mhm.
these landscapes, that know their needs. And so what they did was a payment system where people got paid 7 to 10 euros per cubic meter of water retention that they created.
Mm.
And so people were paid to create water retention on their own landscapes, and then they would get paid as those started functioning. And they found that creation of 5,000 cubic meters of new water holding capacity created downstream water sources at 1 liter per second, which is actually a crazy amount of water produced throughout the year by this small, simple structures. So then the other piece of this that create funding for that would be to have a tax on hard surfaces.
Yep.
So when a
And there are
factory wants
places
to
that have
come
done
in
that.
and
Yeah. LA actually has that, and I don't know if you saw the workshop we did with David McConville and his colleague. That
oh, I missed that
so
one.
yeah, it's really interesting, and I think there's so much in there that's untapped, literally, because they've created some sort of a tax on impermeable surfaces, and that goes into a fund for people to create, all the stuff that we've been talking about. But what David realized is that it was only that fund was only being tapped by people with engineering background. So David created a kind of a mapping app where you can say, if I plant a tree here, if I dig a pond here, if this, and so that it basically helps you to fill out an application to get access to some of that fund. But
Nice.
it's a lot of money. I can't remember, if a few million dollars a year that's
Yeah.
available to community groups if they know how to fill out an application and do it. So
Well, that's super promising and super important. And the number one, the landscapes and nature, they're easy to work with. They're logical. They they do what's in the best common interest. Humans, not so much. And
yeah.
so really having the people who are embedded in that place as early stakeholders in the projects are key to the success of those projects. When we go to India this year, we'll see side by side beautiful examples done by the community with no money, and then situations where the government wanted to try and take credit for this work, so came in and did their own projects without working with the local community. Those projects have all fallen apart and don't do anything for anyone
And
anymore.
aren't
And
kept up because there's no sense of pride in them necessarily too. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So I think it's very important that this work is quite decentralized. It's easy to, as a budget item, it, put a lot of money towards something, but if that big chunk of money, I've worked on some of these like Department of Defense government jobs. There is so much waste along that pipeline. It is insane.
Hmm.
And so I think what's really best is that it's done with the local communities to benefit the local communities. You look at some of the recharge efforts that California has done, like one is running wells in reverse to pump stormwater into aquifers. Now, in theory, that makes a ton of sense. The problem is you're leading contaminated surface water into the aquifer without filtration. So
Yeah.
when it's held in the landscape and soaking through the earth, it's filtered and you get pristine groundwater in your aquifer. With this kind of pumping it right down the well, you're going to pollute an aquifer that's hundreds of thousands, million, I don't know how many years old in just a couple of years by just piping surface water into it.
Yeah.
So I think this is where it really needs to be done by people with connections to those landscapes to actually be in tune with those landscapes.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a good stopping point. It's really great to talk to you, actually. I think we should do this more frequently because there's a lot there. I think we share enough language and concepts to really have fun with this. So, um,
Definitely.
and And yeah, do you want to just give a little plug about the Rajasthan trip? Because that sounds really cool.
Yeah, that would be great. So yeah, this January, it's really a once in a lifetime opportunity we're putting together. It's called a Water Sutra, where we'll be in India with Rajendra for 2 weeks, traveling around as a group to see these different projects for ourselves, to learn the traditional ways of working with water, to learn how they activated these communities to create this effect. Because Rajendra always says, I only built one water body. The communities built the thousands, and I think it's like 12,000, 15,000 different structures that have been created through all of these different villages that led to the revival of these rivers. And so it's really a once in a lifetime opportunity to get to experience these sites for yourself, learn from this brilliant water leader, Rajendra Singh, for 2 weeks, which is going to be amazing just on its own.
Mhm.
Learn how to activate communities, how these communities work through this, and then also have a really amazing cultural experience in this special part of India. So it's going to be January 11th through the 24th. Registration is only open till the 15th of November. So there's about 2 weeks left because we want everyone to travel. It's a lot of travel. So we're all going to be on mini buses and the same stuff together so we can do stuff during that time. And
Yep.
so no one can join after October 15th because we need to start booking all of
No,
that travel at that point.
November
Sorry,
15th.
November 15th. Thank you.
Yep.
No, yeah, so this first 2 weeks in November is last chance to join. It's also going to be just a really amazing group of people. We've been putting together events in person now for the last couple of years, and it's amazing. Us and our students always say, Water Stories people are just the best people in the world because
Mhm.
everyone is so positive, everyone's doing so much, everyone knows so much, and we can all share and work with each other. And then I also forgot to mention this trip to India is also the launch of a wallless, borderless university for water that we're starting with Rajendra Singh, where we help communities understand what they can do. We go to wherever it's needed. This is going to be the university in nature, so there's going to be no building or headquarters for this place. It will know no boundaries. But this trip will also be a really amazing time where we'll be kickstarting that global effort.
Great.
Because we see around the world this connection between heat and hate that's going on, where these places are aridifying, they're getting hotter. People are having to leave their homelands, which people don't
Mhm.
want to do. No one wants to become
Right.
a migrant. They're forced into it. Same thing was happening in India until they started causing the reverse migration. So this heat leads to this fleeing of people, friction and tension leading to hate in these different places. And it can all be quenched with water. And so that's really our hope long term is to be going into these places of greatest need, helping them hold water, reduce the heat, reverse the migration so that we all have healthy, habitable places.
Oh, that's marvelous. I love hearing that. Yeah, that's that's really exciting. I wish I could go along that on that trip with you. I'm gonna look at those dates and see.
You should. It
January's
would be
not a
great
good
to have
month,
you.
but yeah, yeah, that sounds really awesome.
It's a nice time to get away from Vermont for a little bit.
It is. It is. Yeah, I don't know what Rajasthan's like, but the last time when I was in India with Walter Yena, I actually got very sick from the air pollution. Not, I thought I was going to get sick from the water and food and whatever. Not, no problem there, but the air pollution was really rough. Um, so,
And this is why we're going at this time of year. It's actually going to be really nice. It's going to be like 70s during the day, down to 50s at night. And we'll start in Delhi, but quickly the first day get out of Delhi. So
mhm.
it's, yeah, not as, it'll be a pretty nice, comfortable time to be there. Not
Yeah,
the heat of the
yeah.
summer, not the peak of the pollution, but just a nice, pleasant time of year.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds beautiful. Well, at the very least, I look forward to getting the full, lots of stories, lots of pictures. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm sure people are going to really enjoy this and have an appetite for more. So,
Awesome, awesome. Well, this has been super fun. Thanks so much, Didi, for all you do. we've got a lot of collaborators, companions, conspirators in the underground,
Yes.
underneath our feet that just aren't well recognized and understood. So we have a lot of allies in that area, and really appreciate you uh, speaking up and being a voice for them.
Thank you. All right. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.